Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's Aaron Bulma here, military specialist for Carleton County. So I'm going to do the next item on the World War II timeline, which was, of course, after talking about the initial start of World War II, and then talking about the invasion of Poland, case White. Now I'm going to talk to you about the next major item on the list before the invasion of Denmark and Norway. I'm going to talk to you about the Winter War, the Soviet invasion of Finland. So here is the fourth president of Finland. This is Kyoto Kallio, and he is the fourth president of Finland, which is from 1937 to 1940. He's a prominent leader of the Argarian League and served as prime minister 4 times and speaker of the parliament 6 times. Okay, so that's him here on the left, and of course Joseph Stalin on the right, the chairman of the Soviet Union. The Soviet premier Joseph Stalin, of course, after Lenin, Joseph Stalin just had recently signed a treaty with, of course, that his government did, the Molotov Ribbentropp Pact, which was to divide Poland in the start of the Second World War. So this is what we call the Winter War. This lasted since November 30th, 1939, going into, I believe it was March of 1940, the capitulation of Finland. So I'm going to talk to you about the units that differentiate the differences between each sides, and of course the size of it, different certain tactics, whatnot, guerrilla warfare. Okay, so here, of course, here's a picture of Finnish troops in a machine gun position. In April 1938. The NKVD agent Boris Yartsev contacted the Finnish Foreign Minister Rudolf Hulsi and Prime Minister Emil Kajander, stating that the Soviet Union did not trust Germany and that war was considered possible between the two countries. The Red Army would not wait passively behind the border, but would rather advance to meet the enemy. Finnish representatives asserted Yartsev that Finland was committed to a policy of neutrality and that the country would resist any armed incursion. Yartsev, and of course Yartsev suggested that Finland cede or release some islands in the Gulf of Finland and along the seaward approaches to Leningrad, and to, of course, to appease these Soviets. Finland, of course, refused. Negotiations continued throughout 1938 without results. Finnish reception of Soviet entreaties was decidedly cool, as the violent collectivism and purges in Stalin's Soviet Union resulted in a poor opinion of the country. Most of the Finnish communist elite in the Soviet Union had been executed during the Great Purge, of course, further tarnishing the USSR's image of Finland, of course. At the same time, Finland was attempting to negotiate a military cooperation plan with Sweden and hoping to jointly defend the Åland Islands. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, and that was in August of 1939. And that was before the invasion of Poland. The pact was nominally a non-aggression treaty, but it included a secret protocol in which Eastern European countries were divided into spheres of interest. And of course, then that certainly served the Soviet Union, and it was a secret pact, part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that was secretly developed was most of the all of the the Eastern European countries, like such certain countries like Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and whatnot, those countries would go secretly to the Soviet Union, and that certainly was some of that was certainly was the case after they pushed the Nazis back in 1944. Germany began the invasion of Poland 2 days, or a number of days later, of course, and that was September 1st, 1939. Operational plans were made in September for the invasion of course, Poland. That was in September 17th, 1939, when the Soviets took forces in Poland, eastern Poland. On October 5th, the Soviet Union invited a Finnish delegation to Moscow for negotiations, and this is part of just the prelude to the war. So they were supposed to lease a certain amount of land to the Soviet Union for 30 years, and and of course the Finnish were very. This is what the Finns were, in a sense, pressured to do. The Soviet offer divided the Finnish government. Of course, this is an offer for political money, and this is a political and land offer. And the Soviets are after land grab, unbelievable, but was eventually rejected with respect to the opinion of the public and Parliament. On 31st October, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov announced Soviet demands in public in the Supreme Soviet. The Finns made two counteroffers whereby Finland would cede the Terrajoki area to the Soviet Union, which would double the distance between Leningrad and the Finnish border, far less than the Soviets had demanded, as well as the islands in the Gulf of Finland. On 26 November 1939, an incident was reported near the Soviet village of Manilia, close to the border with Finland. A Soviet border guard post had been shelled by an unknown party, resulting, accordingly to Soviet reports, in the deaths of 4 and injuries of 9 border guards. Research conducted by several Finnish and Russian historians later concluded that the shelling was a false flag operation because there was no artillery units placed there at the time, and it was carried out from the Soviet side of the border by an NKVD unit with the purpose of providing the Soviet Union with a casus belli and a pretext to withdraw from the non-aggression pact so that they could invade. So very much like what happened with the start, blaming the Polish for attacking German forces at the radio station. That was what the Germans used as a cover to invade. Molotov claimed that the incident was a Finnish artillery attack and demanded that Finland apologize for the incident and move its forces beyond a line 20 to 25 kilometers, 12 to 16 miles away from the border. Finland denied responsibility for the attack, rejected the demands, and called for a joint Finnish-Soviet commission to examine the incident. And of course, in turn, the Soviet Union claimed the Finnish response was hostile, announcing the non-aggression pact was severely would severely it would, and of course it was they renounced the non-aggression pact. And they severed the diplomatic relations with Finland on the 28th November. I'm just reading some of this here. In the following years, the Soviet historians Of course, they announced it as Finnish provocation. So the Soviet military plan, before the war, Soviet leadership expected total victory within a few weeks. The Red Army had just completed the invasion of eastern Poland at a cost of fewer than 4,000 casualties after Germany attacked Poland from the west. Stalin's expectations of a quick Soviet triumph were backed up by a politician, Andrei Zhdanov, and military strategist Clement Voroshilov. Clement Voroshilov. But other generals were more reserved. The chief of staff of the Red Army, Boris Shapovnikov, advocated a fuller buildup, extensive fire support and logistical preparations, and a rational order of battle, and the deployment of the Army's best units. Zhdanov's military commander, Kirill Meretskov, reported that the terrain of coming operations is split by the Mess rivers, the different rivers, swamps, and is almost entirely covered by forest. And that different forests, it's a very rough terrain. Proper use of our forces, of course, will be difficult. These doubts were not reflected in his troop deployments. So, this is part of the Finnish campaign for the Soviet force. The Soviet forces wanted to have another Blitzkrieg style. They were impressed with Blitzkrieg, and this certainly played the point on that level. They wanted this. They wanted this done quick. They think they could do it within weeks. That certainly was not the case. Stalin's purges in the 1930s had devastated the officers' corps of the Red Army. Those purged included 3 of its 5 marshals, 220 of its 264 division or high-level commanders, and 36,761 officers of all ranks. Fewer than half of all the officers remained. They were commonly replaced by soldiers who were less confident but more loyal to their superiors. Unit commanders were overseen by political commissars, which is not good. I mean, you push to the last man. That's not a military strategy, that's a party strategy. Pull to the last line, even if you lose a vast majority of your soldiers in each of your units. That's exactly what the Soviet line, the party line, was at the time. So, whose approval was, of course, these commissars whose approval was needed to ratify military decisions, and who evaluated those decisions based on their political merits. The dual military decisions the dual system further complicated the Soviet chain of command and annulled the independence of commanding officers. After the Soviet success in the battles of Gall against Japan, on the the Soviet Union's eastern border, Soviet High Command had divided into 2 factions. One side was represented by Spanish Civil War veterans, General Pavel Rachagov from the Soviet Air Force, tank expert General Dmitry Pavlov, and Stalin's favorite general, Marshal Grigory Kulik, Chief of Artillery. The other was led by Gall veterans, General Georgy Zhukov, which is a major commander in the Second World War. Georgy Zhukov is one of the top commanders going, which up into the end of the Second World War. course, of the Red Army, and of course General Grigory Kravchenko of the Soviet Air Force. Under this divided command structure, the lessons of the Soviet Union's first real war on a massive scale using tanks, artillery, and aircraft at Khalkhin went unheeded, of course. As a result, Russian BT tanks were less successful during the Winter War. The BT-25 light tanks, the Soviets had 35,000 of them, massive amount of them. These tanks were proven certainly inferior to German tanks when the Germans launched the Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, 1941. This is certainly here as well due to terrain. They were used impractically, and the terrain is hilly, it's mountainous, lots of snow, up to 10 feet of snow, lots of forests, and very difficult for logistic support to be brought up, and also including tanks with firepower. Certainly less successful that these tanks were, and it took the Soviet Union 3 months and over 1 million men to accomplish what Zhukov did at Khalkhin in 10 days. The Soviet generals were impressed by the success of German Blitzkrieg tactics. Like I mentioned, Blitzkrieg had been tailored to Central European conditions with a dense mapping. They had a dense map network of paved roads. Armies fighting in Central Europe had recognized supply and communication centers, which could be easily targeted by armored vehicle regiments. Finnish Army centers, by contrast, were deep inside the country. There were no paved roads. Even gravel or dirt roads were scarce. Most of the terrain consisted of trackless forests and swamps. War correspondent John Langdon Davies observed the landscape as follows. Every acre of its surface was created to be the despair of an attacking military force. Waging Blitzkrieg in Finland was a highly difficult proposition, and according to Trotter, the Red Army failed to meet the level of tactical coordination and local initiative required to execute Blitzkrieg tactics in Finland, in the Finnish theater. And that's one of their, I believe Trotter is one of their, comes up here, one of their historians later on. The Finnish forces were organized as follows. The Soviet forces were organized as follows. The Finnish forces will be coming after. The Soviet forces organized the 7th Army, comprising 9 divisions, a tank corps, and 3 tank brigades, was located on the Karelian Isthmus. Its objective was the city of Viborg. The force was later divided into the 7th and 13th armies. The 8th Army, comprising 6 divisions and a tank brigade, was located north of Lake Ladoga. Its mission was to execute a flanking maneuver around the northern shore of Lake Ladoga to strike at the rear of the Mannerheim line. The 9th Army was positioned to strike into central Finland through the Kanu region. It was comprised of 3 divisions, with 1 more on its way. Its mission was to thrust westward to cut Finland directly in half. The 14th Army, comprising 3 divisions, was based in Murmansk. Its objective was to capture the Arctic port of Petsamo and then advance to the town of Rovaniemi. So here are the Soviet T-26 tanks, light tanks of the Soviet 7th Army during its advance on the Karelian Isthmus in Finland. The most common Finnish artillery was piece. This is the most common piece. Was a 76mm gun. dating back to around the year 1902. 76K02. This is a towed artillery piece. The gun stands camouflaged in the city of Viipuri in March 1940. So, the Finnish strategy was dictated by geography, of course, right? Its geography was hilly, it's mountainous, it's also, there's a lot of major snows, hill embankments, and forests. A lot of forestry. The 1,340 kilometer long frontier with the Soviet Union was mostly impassable except along a handful of unpaved roads. In pre-war calculations, the Finnish Defense Command, which had established its wartime headquarters at Mikkeli, had estimated 7 Soviet divisions on Karelian Isthmus and no more than 5 along the whole border north of Lake Ladoga. In the estimation, the manpower ratio would have favored the attacker by 3 to 1. The true ratio was much higher. For example, 12 Soviet divisions were deployed to the north of Lake Ladoga. An even greater problem than lack of soldiers was the lack of material. Foreign shipments of anti-tank weapons and aircraft were arriving in small quantities, and that's certainly a problem for Finland coming into this. The ammunition situation was alarming, as stockpiles had cartridges, shells, and fuel only to last 19 to 60 days. The ammunition shortage meant the Finns could seldom afford counter-battery or saturation fire to Soviet artillery. Finnish tank forces were operationally non-existent. The ammunition situation was alleviated somewhat, since Finns were largely armed with Mosin-Nagant rifles, which are Soviet-issue rifles, in 1891-30, 7.62 times 54R standard rifles. I fire them. They're very accurate. They're a very good rifle. There's numerous different types of them. Many of these were dated from the Finnish Civil War, which used the cartridge I just mentioned. Of course, and it's also used by Soviet forces, and it's a Soviet rifle. I mean, some Finnish soldiers maintained their ammunition supply by looting the bodies of dead Soviet soldiers. The Finnish forces were positioned as follows. The Army of the Isthmus was comprised of 6 divisions under the command of Hugo Otterman. The 2nd Army Corps was positioned on its right flank, and the 3rd Army Corps, and I'll show you these in the maps coming up here. 3rd Army Corps on its left flank. The 4th Army Corps was located north of Lake Ladoga. It was composed of 2 divisions under Juho Heikkensman, who was soon replaced by Waldemar Haglund. The North, and that's another commander that takes over in this operation. The North Finland Group was a collection of white guards, border guards, and drafted reservist units under Tumpel. So here you can see which will be the retreating infantry divisions. It very much is an infantry war. If you look at some of the tactics that were used and the weather, looking at -40 below zero weather, the Soviets at the time, you're thinking that there would be the forces of the Soviet Union would be equipped to deal with winter weather on this scale. They didn't have the amount of equipment long term for this war to last without they didn't have enough winter equipment for this war to last for a long period of time. And the conditions, there's reports, there are pictures even on here from the Finnish War Ministry, Finnish War Archives, of Soviet soldiers froze to death on the battlefields. So, November 30th, 1939, nearly 500,000 Soviet troops stormed into Finland, beginning what would become known as the Winter War. The surprise attack came after the Kremlin, fearing a possible Nazi offensive through Finland, had insistently called for a land swap that would have pushed the Finnish border away from Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, where, of course, they would be wary of Soviet intentions. Finland's government certainly refused. They were wary that they were going to possibly attack. Soviet planners assumed an easy victory in time for Joseph Stalin's 60th birthday on December 21st. It was certainly not to be. Although the Red Army would eventually win the war, the defeat of the country of just 3.7 million people came only months later, and at a terrible cost. And that terrible cost, hundreds of thousands of men. The casualties for the Finnish, 25,904 dead or missing, 43,557 wounded, 800 to 1,100 captured. The Soviets had 48,745 dead or missing, but actually the numbers go up. The numbers go up to 167,976 dead or missing, and 88,000 to 207,000 wounded or sick, including at least 61,506 sick or frostbitten, 5,572 captured, including up to 3,500 tanks, and so the casualties, that's casualties of tanks, up to 515 aircraft shot down. Amazing. Total casualties for the Soviets are 321,000 to 381,000. Staggering. Amazing. They just basically bulldoze through it. Just basically blunt object. It's basically a blunt style, brutal strikes. Just a brutal use of men and manpower, and losing so much men and manpower at the same time, with no good, valid, clear strategy as to try to win it. Certainly, they had to adapt tactics to the Finnish. The Finnish, how they were able to hang on for so long, is guerrilla warfare, mobile attacks, snipers, and being able to fighting in their own dooryards, being able to camouflage themselves for numerous periods of time. Many infantry, were being sniped at, being shot by snipers and mowed down by machine gun fire, but eventually the numbers succeeded in breaking the camel's back. And of course, only 7,000, for the Finnish side, about 70,000 dead. So the Russian invasion was meant to follow the Blitzkrieg model, which had served the Germans certainly so well in Poland. A swift, hard-hitting advance that would use superior resources and technology to overcome resistance. But while Poland was a land of open plains, Finland was one of frozen forests and deep, deep snow. This was no place for Blitzkrieg, and that's obvious. Roads buried beneath 10 feet of snow blocked the Soviet advance. Ground kept warm by the snow above, turned into muddy swamps through which the infantry had to trudge. Many vehicles could only advance after hundreds of infantry had gone before them, stamping down the snow, while getting mowed down or shot at the same time while firing back. So here we have a woman weeping as Helsinki residents file into a bomb shelter. These pictures are some of the approximately 7,000 images of the Winter War from the Finnish Defense Forces archives that were digitalized and released to the public in 2013. Tongue twisted there. Here's a shattered building. Here's shattered buildings and a car burn in Helsinki. Cars, vehicles burning everywhere in Helsinki after an air raid on the opening day of the Winter War, November 30th. Soviet forces were known to just bomb entire villages to the ground, sledgehammer blows, with artillery, tanks. Whatever resistance there was, it was either had to retreat eventually, or the defensive positions were utterly destroyed. Buildings, houses, structures of any type were destroyed to a large degree by bombing and heavy devastation from attacking Soviet forces, certainly in the larger cities. Buildings burn in this is in a suburb in Helsinki, the capital of Finland. Amid an international outcry over the unannounced attack on Finland, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov claimed on the radio that the planes were dropping food supplies rather than bombs to hungry Finlanders. Of course, that was a lie. So here we have more Soviet, looks like more Soviet forces here. I believe that there's either that or these are Finnish forces after captured a Soviet tank. So here's just a bit more of the data. Of course, the league, the internet, the league. Sorry, I'm just reading some stuff. So, of course, the League of Nations expelled the USSR on the 14th of December after a vote, and exhorted its members, to aid Finland as part of the ongoing situation that was happening at the time. The League of Nations was what the UN is today. And sorry, I'm looking for something here. A Soviet plane on a bombing run. Here's one of the, I believe it's a yak on a bombing run. So there were international volunteers, and here's a small sample of them. Swedish volunteers during the Winter War, carrying boys' anti-tank rifles on their backs. These are anti-tank rifles that are a single shot. They're multiple shot, like three or four rounds, and they're 14.5 millimeter, and they are capable of taking out tanks, mainly lighter tanks, depending. Rear armor that is lighter. They are still very capable. Certainly, these are a British design, and certainly this is something that was that was used by Swedish volunteers. They were effective, certainly on ambush with ambush forces. Finnish forces, of course, they were working alongside them. They provided support and were capable of carrying out attacks and destroying the Soviet T-25 tanks. Some of the other weapons that were used, of course, you have the Mosin-Nagants, Luger, PO8 Luger. The PO8 Lugers, they did have a number of them. Tokarov TT-33 pistols, which were the standard Soviet pistols at the time. They were used there. The Civil Guard Mosin-Nagant rifles, of course. The Soviets, either Mosin-Nagants or they also had the SVT-38, SVT-40, which were semi-automatic rifles. The SVT-40s carry a 10-round magazine. They're very similar. They're very similar type to the Gewehr 43, which is a the Gewehr rifles are at least the later variants carry a 10-round magazine, similar to what we have, similar to what the SVT-40 has. The P-31 submachine gun is another weapon that was used. So here, and of course, the Boys anti-tank rifle is something that I would certainly like to build. Coming up, that would be quite a large project. I'm planning on building one. These were produced from 1937 to 1943. They were used in the Second Sino-Japanese War, certainly World War II, Greco-Italian War, different wars, the Greek Civil War, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. These were definitely used, and 62,000 of them were built. There's the Mark I, the Mark II. So at the rate of fire, these could fire 10 rounds a minute. It had a 5-round detachable box magazine, so it wasn't 4, it was 5 rounds. Effective firing range, penetration at 90 to 100 yards away. I mean, certainly a deadly weapon, and certainly, well, and definitely, it's what we today call an anti-material rifle. This anti-material rifle, a lot of them that we use today, our snipers would use, or 5-star snipers, would use 50 caliber and whatnot. Usually either that or even 408 Chaytak ammunition, Chaytak intervention, different and similar calibers. So this, like the Spanish Civil War before, the Winter War became a rallying point for opposition to what many saw as a dangerous ideology and policies of a dictator. Money and supplies were raised from countries around the world. Though a German blockade made it hard to get them through, messages of support were sent by prominent figures in Washington. France and Britain talked about sending their own troops into Finland. On the 1st of December 1939, the Soviet Union formed a puppet government called the Finnish Democratic Republic, and headed by Otto Willi Kunsinen. In the parts of Finnish Karelia occupied by the Soviets, and then, of course, that was the area that he controlled. Kunsinen's government was also referred to as the Terajaki government, after the village of Terajaki, which, of course, the first settlement captured by the advancing Red Army. After the war, the puppet government was disbanded. From the very outset of the war, working-class Finns stood behind the legitimate government in Helsinki. Finnish national unity against the Soviet invasion was later called the spirit of the Winter War. And here are some of the Finnish soldiers on the front lines. So, situation on the 7th of December, Soviets had reached the Mannerheim line on the Karelian Isthmus. So this is in here's Viborg. And here are some of the, like Ladoga here, and there's Leningrad, and so you can see the connection right here and moving upward. And Finland is a very small country compared, of course, the Soviet Union. Here is Third Corps, Second Corps. So those are the units I'd mentioned earlier. Starikov, Karapechnikov, Korolenko. These are all commanders who are commanding 10th, 43rd, 50th regiments, and of course these infantry and corps. These are units pushing in days, just about. This is a week after the initial attack. Although outgunned and outnumbered, Finnish fighters used the few advantages they had with devastating effect. The Mannerheim Line, an array of Finnish defense structures, was located on the Karelian Isthmus, approximately 30 to 75 kilometers, 19 to 47 miles from the Soviet border. The Red Army soldiers on the Isthmus numbered 250,000, facing 130,000 Finns. The Finnish command deployed a defense in depth of about 21,000 men in the area in front of the Mannerheim Line to delay and damage the Red Army before it reached the line. In combat, the most severe cause of confusion amongst Soviet soldiers, amongst Finnish soldiers, was Soviet tanks. They didn't think they'd come at them with tanks. The Finns had few anti-tank weapons and insufficient training in modern anti-tank tactics. According to Trotter, the favorite Soviet armored tactic was a simple frontal charge. And that's certainly this is certainly the truth in all throughout the Second World War. The weaknesses of which could be exploited, of course, because these tanks could be take tracks off. You could immobilize them. You could, with what anti-tank firepower and artillery you have, you could take out a number of them, and you could immobilize them with certainly the terrain. The Finns learned that at close range, tanks could be dealt with in many ways. For example, logs and crowbars jammed into the bogey wheels would often immobilize a tank. Soon Finns fielded a better ad hoc weapon, the Molotov cocktail. Of course, this Molotov cocktail, a glass bottle filled with flammable liquids, of course, different types of alcohol, oils, and different fuels, and with a simple hand-lit fuse, so like a rag, and you light it in the bottle, screw it tight, and then Molotov cocktails were eventually mass-produced by the Finnish Alcoholic Beverage Corporation and bundled with matches with which to light them. 80 Soviet tanks were destroyed in the border zone engagements. In that way, and in other similar ways. By the 6th of December, all the Finnish covering forces had withdrawn to the Mannerheim Line. The Red Army began its first major attack against the line in Taipale, the area between the shore of Lake Ladoga, the Taipale River, and the Sorvento waterway. Along the Sorvento sector, the Finns had a slight advantage of the elevation and dry ground to dig into. The Finnish artillery had scouted the area and made fire plans in advance, anticipating a Soviet assault. The Battle of Taipale began with a 40-hour Soviet artillery preparation. After the barrage, Soviet infantry attacked across open ground, but was repulsed with heavy casualties. From the 6th to the 12th of December, the Red Army continued to try to engage using only a single division. Next, the Red Army strengthened its artillery and deployed tanks and the 150th Rifle Division forward to the Taipei front. On the 14th of December, the bolstered Soviet forces launched a new attack, but were pushed back again. A third Soviet division entered the fight, but performed poorly and panicked under shell fire. The assaults continued without success, and the Red Army suffered heavy losses. One typical Soviet attack during the battle lasted just an hour, but left 1,000 dead and 27 tanks strewn on the ice. And north of Lake Ladoga, on the Ladoga-Karelia front, the defending Finnish units relied on the terrain. Ladoga-Karelia, a large forest wilderness, did not have road networks for the modern Red Army. The Soviet Eighth Army had extended a new railroad line to the border, which could double the supply capability on the front. On 12 December, the advancing Soviet 139th Rifle Division, supported by the 56th Rifle Division, was defeated by a much smaller Finnish force under Pavel Tavela and Torvajavli. The first Finnish victory of the war. Some of these names are hard to pronounce, that's for sure. Dressed in white camouflage, the defenders were almost impossible to see amongst snow-dusted trees, and that's the best place for it to hide snipers, anti-tank riflemen, machine gunners. Most Soviet soldiers had proper winter clothes, but this was not the case with every unit. In the Battle of Soromalmai, thousands of Soviet soldiers died of frostbite. The Soviet troops also lacked skill in skiing, and that's what the Finnish certainly had that advantage, mobility. So soldiers were restricted to movement by road and were forced to move in long columns. The Red Army lacked proper winter tents, and troops had to sleep in improvised shelters. So improvised shelters could mean anything from, using sleeping bags and sewing them together. It could be to improvising with the cutting down trees. Amazing. The Red Army lacked proper winter tents, and certainly that's a major problem for them at this point. Some Soviet units incurred frostbite casualties as high as 10% even before crossing the Finnish border. The cold weather did confer an advantage to Soviet tanks, as they could move over frozen terrain and bodies of water rather than being immobilized in swamps and mud. According to Khrushchev, at least 61,506 Soviet troops were sick or frostbitten during the war. That's an amazing amount of numbers. Here we have some Finnish troops waiting for Soviet troops to come up online. For many of the encircled Soviet troops in a pocket, they call it a madi in Finnish, originally meaning 1 to 3 meters, so 35 cubic feet of firewood. Staying alive was an ordeal comparable to combat, and certainly in minus 40 degree weather. The men were freezing and starving and enduring poor sanitary conditions. Historian William R. Trotter described these conditions as follows: the Soviet soldier had no choice. If he refused to fight, he would be shot. If he tried to sneak through the forest, he would freeze to death. And surrender was no option for him. Soviet propaganda had told him how the Finns would torture prisoners to death, whether being true or not. Here's a Finnish 7.62 millimeter YT Soranta M26 light machine gun. Some of these names are hard to pronounce. That's definitely true. The M26 light machine gun, one of the many different types of weapons they had. Sometimes they had few of them. They had a hard time, certainly, with getting supplies to the front in a large amount of numbers at certain times, but they had the mobility, and they had ways to improvise doing it. Soviet forces had an even much harder time bringing in supplies and machinery. One of the major battles of this war was the Battle of the Mannerheim Line. The terrain of the Karelian Isthmus did not allow guerrilla tactics, so the Finns were forced to resort to the more conventional Mannerheim Line, more conventional fight, with its flanks protected by large bodies of water. Soviet propaganda claimed that it was as strong as, or even stronger than the Maginot Line. So that, I believe that the Finnish were they're definitely very resilient people. Finnish historians, for their part, have belittled the line's strength, insisting that it was mostly conventional trenches and log-covered dugouts. The Finns had built 221 strong points along the Karelian Isthmus, mostly in the early 1920s. Many were extended in the late 1930s. Despite these defensive preparations, even the most fortified section of the Mannerheim Line had only one reinforced concrete bunker per kilometer. Overall, the line was weaker than similar lines in mainland Europe. According to the Finns, the real strength of the line was the stubborn defenders, with a lot of sisu, a Finnish idiom roughly translating as guts, fighting, and spirit. So, here's one machine gun post here. They're on the front, I think, around the Mannerheim Line. Battles in Ladoga, Karelia, north of Lake Ladoga. The attack of the Soviet 8th Army was halted at the Finnish defensive line on 12th December 1939. So, on the Mannerheim Line, of course, the Finnish Army couldn't hope to match Soviet firepower. That is certain. But they had the maneuverability and the guerrilla warfare tactics, and they were used in other battles. Certainly, the Mannerheim Line. Certainly, they had to capitulate and push back and retreat, but they were able to hold on for a certain amount of time. One cheap anti-tank weapon, of course, the Finns were talking about, was the Molotov. This is the Molotov cocktail. Picture made of gasoline and tar, so it'll stick to tanks, stick to engine parts, showing their dense, dark sense of humor. This is, of course, their dark sense of humor. The fighters named the firebombs after the Soviet foreign minister, and it's stuck ever since as a drink to go with the food that Molotov had claimed to be dropping on Finland. And that's a famous quote. This is a famous name for a famous weapon that could be still used today. It's a third world country grenade, incendiary grenade. Still very effective. Of course, thus giving birth to its often used weapon in conflicts throughout the decades since. It's used ever since. Strength of the Red Army north of Lake Ladoga in Ladoga, Karelia, surprised the Finnish headquarters. 2 Finnish divisions were deployed there. The 12th Division, led by Lauri Tallinen, and the 13th Division, led by Hinu Enkansila, They also had a support group of 3 brigades, bringing a total strength of over 30,000. The Soviets deployed a division for almost every road leading west to the Finnish border. The 8th Army was led by Ivan Khabarov. Who, of course, was replaced by Grigory Stern on 13th of December. The Soviet mission was to destroy Finnish troops in the area of Ladoga, Karelia, and it's right here. And advanced into the area between Sortavala and Gornsu within 10 days. The Soviets had a 3-to-1 advantage in manpower and a 5-to-1 advantage in artillery, as well as air supremacy. Finnish forces panicked and retreated in front of the overwhelming Red Army. The commander of the Finnish 4th Army Corps, Juho Heinksaven, Heiskanen, was replaced by another commander, Haglund, on 4th December. On 7th December, in the middle of the Ladoga Karelian front, Finnish units retreated near the small stream of Korola. The waterways itself did not and of course they didn't offer protection, but alongside it there were ridges up to 10 meters, 33 feet high. The ensuing Battle of Kola lasted until the end of the war. Some of these battles continued until the end of the war. There was a memorable, of course, fighter here. Kola Holds, of course, is what it was called, certainly with these 10-meter ridges. The major, of course, and one other major hero in this battle, further contributing to the legend of Kola, was the sniper Simo Heija. It's Heija, I think. He was dubbed the White Death by Soviets and credited with over 500 kills. This is a sniper. To the north, the Finns retreated to other centers on the 5th of December and repelled a Soviet offensive in the Battle of Tolvajari. On 11th December. In the south, 2 Soviet divisions, of course, I don't want to read all of it, but these 2 Soviet divisions were united on the northern side of Lake Ladoga, coastal road, and they continued fighting. This fighting continues up into March, and I want to just go over some of the tactics. I don't want to read all of it. It's but of course, certain battles continued on through 6th to the 16th of January 1940. So here he is, Simo Heija, a Finnish sniper dubbed White Death. Professional farmer and hunter Simo Heija reportedly killed more than 500 Soviet soldiers during the Winter War before he was shot in the face and badly wounded by a Soviet sharpshooter. Later in life, when asked if he regretted killing so many young men, he responded, "I only did what I was told to do, as well as I could." He died in 2002 and was buried under a tombstone reading Home, Religion, and Fatherland. So he's a hero, a Finnish war hero during that time period. So here is another major engagement where the Soviets lost thousands of men. Isomasali right engagement was a double operation which would later be used by military academics as a classic example of what well-led troops and innovative tactics can do against a much larger adversary. So the Soviets suffered 7 to 9,000 casualties. Amazing. It was a small town of 4,000 people, and with long lakes, a wild force, Red Army, of course, and the Red Army committed 2 divisions to this in order to cross this wilderness, and they lost a lot of men. Here's a picture of it. Dead Soviet soldiers and their equipment at Rat Road. After being encircled at the Battle of Rat Road. Oh, wow, that's amazing. What a waste. So here is some pictures of Finnish soldiers. In January 1940, Britain's, of course, Winston Churchill was in power. He says this of the ongoing war: Finland shows what free men can do. Everyone can see how communism rots the soul of a nation, how it makes it abject and hungry in peace, and prove it base and abominable in war. We cannot tell what the fate of Finland may be, but no more mournful spectacle could be presented than that this splendid northern race should be at last worn down and reduced to servitude worse than death by the dull, brutish force of overwhelming numbers. And that is so true. Here's a Soviet soldier frozen to death. He lies where he died. Temperatures in Finland dropped below minus 40 degrees Celsius during the war. Amazing. I don't think I remember it. Oh, nothing. We've never had, at least for a very long time, I don't remember it ever being that cold here, or even maybe one day in northern New Brunswick and Edmonton, but up above that. But we've had minus 40 here before, but above minus 40, no. I mean, not for a very long time. The Red Army at the time had a policy of not training its troops in temperatures lower than minus 15 Celsius. Amazing, shocking and amazing, considering that that's very much a winter country. The Lapland is another major area where battling continued in Finland. In southern Lapland, near the village of Sala, the Soviet 88th and 122nd Divisions, totaling 35,000 men, advanced in the Battle of Sala. The Soviets proceeded easily to Sala, where the road forked. The northern branch moved toward Poksolinmai, while the rest approached Kemijärvi. Kemijärvi. It was another town. On the 17th of December, the Soviet Northern Group, comprised an infantry regiment, a battalion, and a company of tanks, was outflanked by a Finnish battalion, and of course an ongoing. And this is just some of the more data that I have here. This is a town in southern Finland, burned after a Soviet airstrike. On wooden structures that the Finnish infrastructure had, Soviet bombers would drop incendiary cluster bombs, and these settlements that were made out of wood were perfect targets for them. Here's Finnish fighters retreating through Viborg. With overwhelming numbers, the Soviets began forcing back the exhausted Finnish troops. In March 1940, as Soviet troops entered the suburb of Viborg, the Finns had little choice but to accept harsh Soviet terms for an armistice. Finnish flags lowered at half-mast in Helsinki, and this is in March 13th, 1940, after the peace agreement became public. The USSR certainly had its own tactics, costly, brutal ways, but ways which could win, and this certainly finally did break the camel's back. Flinging thousands of men into head-on battle assaults, they wore down Finnish resistance and eventually breached the defensive lines. Outnumbered, outgunned, and with their plans broken, the Finns were forced to seek peace. It was a peace the Soviets were willing to accept. The war had cost them hugely in terms of men, material, and reputation. It was a painful embarrassment. They wanted to put they wanted to put this behind them. Despite this, they held enough Finnish territory to seek terms that suited them. On 12th of March 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Finland conceded 11% of its territory, 30% of its economic base. So Finland conceded 11% of its territory, 30% of its economic base to the USSR. 422,000 Finns lost their homes. According to the armistice, cost Finland 11% of its territory, including the country's second largest city of Viborg. The Winter War left about 25,904 Finns dead. Of course, the Soviets lost, and these numbers here are different from the numbers I've read from other sources that I gave earlier. At least 126,875 soldiers dead. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, later called all of us and Stalin first and foremost, since of course he recalled all of this, and Stalin, and of course then they sensed in a victory, a defeat by the certainly a defeat by the Finns, but a victory for them overall. If that makes sense, what I'm saying here. It was a dangerous defeat because it encouraged our enemies' conviction in that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, and that's what it encouraged. Just over a year after the Winter War ended, Finland made a disastrous decision to join the Nazi invasion of the USSR. And that was, of course, it ended up being disastrous for them. The Soviets had learned a lesson from the Winter War as well. They re-equipped their battered armies with better equipment, particularly the T-34 medium tank, fast medium tank with a 76mm gun on it. And most of the Soviet heavy tanks at the time were IS-2. Of course, they had the KV-1, KV-2, and IS-3 and IS-4, and then development, and then of course T-25 tanks, which were shown there. The T-34s were certainly a tank that was to be reckoned with, and eventually it would certainly help the Soviets to defeat the German forces of the Wehrmacht. Certainly Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and Tiger Is, which would be Panzer VI tanks with 88mm guns, proved a major, colossal enemy. But thousands upon thousands of these tanks and factories, once they were moved from the the borderlines of the Soviet Union, the Western Soviet Union, into say deep into the Urals and to Siberia. The mass production began, and that's after the German invasion in '41, and that presumed and finally, of course, with the Battle of Stalingrad, which I'll talk all about this later on in another video. Eventually, that broke the German will and certainly the German war industry's back. Fighting a two-front war with America and the Soviet Union was never a plan for Hitler, but it eventually led to his certain defeat. Hitler watched from Germany. Of course, he had also learned a lesson from this war here, that Russia was weak, or so he thought, and he could confidently invade and conquer the country. And that's what his plan was later on with Barbarossa. But Hitler had not learned all the tactical lessons of the war. He failed to realize the ability of it being ill-equipped but determined forces to hold back. He failed to realize the ability of ill-equipped but determined forces to hold back better equipped foes, and the dangers of a war in winter. And certainly that was apparent with Soviet forces. Next time these would aid the Soviets, not stop them. And the lessons learned from the Finns would allow them to beat the Germans. The Red Army, here's Red Army soldiers with a captured Finnish state flag. Alright, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.